Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. Just a few technology tips before we get started. All attendees will be muted throughout the presentation. So every once in a while, be sure to tap your mouse just so that your screen does not go to sleep. All time for questions and answers will be at the end of the presentation, but feel free to text chat in your questions throughout the presentation as they come up. You'll see a box to the right side of your screen with a red arrow. Just expand that arrow, and you'll have a text box where you can type in your questions, and they'll come to us here, and then we'll read them to the presenters at the end. A recording of today's presentation will be available on farmcrediteast.com/webinars for playback at a later time. If you're having any trouble accessing that, feel free to contact myself, Christy Schmidt, at 800-562-2235. And now we will get started.
Okay, thank you, Christy. Good morning. This is Jim Putnam with Farm Credit East, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar discussing the Dairy Margin Protection Program, and we're really going to get into considerable depth with that this morning. And we are very pleased to partner on this program with NEDPA, the Northeast Dairy Producers Association, with New York Farm Bureau, and with Cornell Pro-Dairy program, and all of those partners are very important parts of the Northeast dairy industry infrastructure here, and so we are very pleased to have them on board as co-sponsors of the program this morning. I've been asked to do a brief introduction on our three speakers this morning, and I could go on and on with a couple of these old friends of mine, but I'm going to keep it brief this morning. But I'm going to cover it this way and say that we've got the A team when it comes to dairy analysis and program implementation and related topics, and they've been working hard here since the passage of the Farm Bill last winter to get us to this position where we really could kind of understand the mechanics of the program and begin to make critical farm-by-farm decisions. So our three speakers this morning are Andy Novakovic, and he is Professor of Agricultural Economics at Cornell University. His work primarily focuses on the economics of agricultural markets and the impacts of policy decisions on American agriculture. And Andy holds a PhD from Purdue University. Second speaker is Mark Stephenson, and he is the Director of Dairy Policy Analysis at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He conducts and coordinates research and outreach related to a wide variety of dairy industry topics, and he holds a PhD from Cornell University. Our final speaker is John Newton, a clinical assistant professor in agricultural commodity markets in the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And John holds a PhD from the Ohio State University. So again, I want to upfront thank these three gentlemen. I know they've worked hard to get us to this point. They've got some great tools and analysis that they're going to share with us. And I think they're going to make us all a whole lot smarter about how to understand and implement this program. So with no further ado, let's go to our first speaker, Christy. And that's Andy.
All right. Is my presentation showing up for everyone?
It is.
All right. So thank you, Jim, for that introduction, and thanks for having us here. My task is to spend the next 15 minutes or so visiting with you about the basic structure and rules that pertain to the margin protection program. There's been more than a little bit of discussion of this, certainly. I'm having a little funny display here. In the past, and so I'm gonna do this in a very outline form and not get into the weeds here at all. And if you find that you've got a question about these, certainly jot it down, because I'm not going to try to give a whole lot of depth in this presentation, but more of a broad overview. My colleague, John Newton, is going to pick up after I'm done and talk about the market expectations part of our tool that really is so essential to trying to figure out how do I approach this program and what can or could or should I do with it as I look down the road. And then Mark will be demonstrating the tool that I think is going to provide just an awful lot of ways for producers to think about not only what they could do in the future, but how the tool works and how different years might have looked historically, and I'll of course let my colleagues get into that. First of all, the margin protection program in its broadest form can be understood as a way to compensate, to provide some cash assistance to all dairy farmers who enroll when market prices for milk aren't quite enough to cover the costs of milking cows and all the attendant herd that goes along with those cows. It's a type of income over feed cost calculation that we're increasingly, I think, going to be looking at as a benchmark, as an indicator for what's happening financially on the farm. It's important to understand that there's nothing about this program that's going to prevent markets from doing what markets do. It's not going to support the price of milk in the way that the old price support program was able to do for much of the 20th century. It's not going to do anything to contain the cost of feed. It has no ceilings or ability to affect the price of corn or the price of soybean meal or hay. So it's going to just say, all right, fine. Whatever markets do, let's take a look at it. And if it heads south for a dairy farmer, it's going to create an opportunity for producers to receive kind of a supplemental benefit payment that hopefully will come in time to provide some cash flow for producers who probably are experiencing some financial difficulty. This program, somewhat like MILC, requires you to sign up to say, yes, I want to participate. But of course, it's going to require a little more thought and a little more involvement and also a little more skin in the game than we saw with MILC. One of the things that I also want to kind of say up front before we get too much into the rules is how a producer participates in this program, what choice they make, I think is going to be very much influenced by what you bring to this program in terms of a perspective about what it's supposed to do for you. This is something very much that gets into how you use the tool, and Mark will demonstrate some of the information that's available in this tool to help you think about ways in which you might use it for your own personal goals. I'm sure all three of us and every extension educator you talk to, people at Farm Credit, are going to say, look, this is your decision as a producer. We're not going to tell you how to make a decision. But one thing I will say is the kind of strategy that you bring to this is going to influence what decision you make, what rational decision you would make. And I think the two big perspectives are, am I looking at this program as a way to make money? Is my goal to maximize some benefit relative to a premium that I pay? Or is my goal more related to a comprehensive risk management strategy where I'm not necessarily looking to maximize my expected net benefits so much as I'm really looking to minimize some bad financial outcome that I can't afford to self-finance. At some point, it's going to be worth it to me to pay a little money for the opportunity to get a benefit payment when something really bad happens. And that thinking, that approach, is something each producer sort of has to ask himself. What am I bringing to this opportunity? What am I thinking about in terms of what I want to get out of this program? The basic process of the program is fairly simple. There is what USDA is going to call a registration period. You're enrolling, you're signing up. They're going to refer to it as registering. And we're obviously in that registration period right now. And the registration period that we're in until the end of November pertains to actually two benefit periods, the last 4 months of 2014 and the full calendar year of 2015. Once we get into the swing of this, we're going to have a registration period that runs from July to September, more or less summer months, and that will be for decisions and benefits that would occur in the next calendar year. So pretty soon, in about a half a year, we're going to be back in the thick of it, thinking about what you want to do for calendar year 2016 and so on. The enrollment decision involves two basic pieces. One of them establishes how much quantity of milk you can enroll in the program. That's called your production history. The second part is to decide what your coverage level is. You know, how much are you willing to pay in order to receive a coverage at a high level versus a low level. A couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, you don't have to enroll during this registration period. If you do enroll in this registration period, you don't have to enroll for 2014. You may enroll for 2015. If you don't want to enroll for 2015, you don't have to do anything. You can wait till 2016. If you don't want to do it in 2016, you can wait till 2017. So there's no lost opportunity if you decide to just sit this one out. However, there is one little caveat that might make it reasonable to think about enrolling for the 2015 year, and that is something called the bump, which I'm going to get back to in more detail in a bit, but just put kind of a little sticky note on that word bump, and we'll come back to what that means. The other thing to keep in mind is once you're in, you're in. If you register for 2015, let's say, you are automatically going to be registered for 2016, 2017, and 2018. That means at a minimum you're going to have to pay the $100 administrative fee, but you don't necessarily have to pay any premiums. There is the catastrophic level of coverage, the absolute bare minimum level of coverage has no premium attached to it, and so if you decided you wanted to kind of sit 1 year out, you didn't think the risks were great or whatever your rationale was, the most you would be held to is that $100 administrative fee, and that will be billed annually as soon as you enroll in the program. Of course, the first question everybody has to ask themselves is, am I eligible? And for most people, it's going to be pretty straightforward. Yeah, you are eligible. If you were in MILC and you didn't have some major change, you didn't retire, you didn't bring in a bunch of new complicated owners, you're going to be eligible for MPP dairy. Obviously, you have to be a current dairy farmer. You have to be marketing milk in the United States. You have to be, if you're not a U.S. citizen, you have to at least be a permanent resident. So if there's somebody out there who's got, an ownership arrangement that involves a foreign owner who doesn't have permanent residence, so, Uncle Adrian in the Netherlands or what have you, that's going to complicate your enrollment process. It doesn't mean you can't enroll, but you want to go to FSA and find out how that's being handled. And like MILC, you have to certify that you're conservation compliant. It's not a high bar, but it's something you definitely need to pay attention to. Once you determine you're eligible as a person or as a business entity, the next step is to identify what quantity of milk is associated with this business entity and what can you enroll in the program. And the first part of that is establishing what USDA is calling your production history. You might think of it as a base. USDA isn't going to use that word, but it's kind of generically what we're talking about. If you were in business before the 8th of February 2013, before 8th of February 2013, you are considered an existing producer. And for an existing producer, all you have to do is say, how much milk did I market in 2011? How much milk did I market in 2012? How much milk did I market in 2013? Write those numbers down, circle the one that's highest. That will be your production history. Of course, you're going to have to give evidence of those commercial marketings, but it's really just as simple as that. If you began your operation after the 7th of February, again, 2013, I apologize for the mistake. If you began after that magic date last year, you're considered a new producer. And basically, you're going to have two options for coming up with a 12-year production history. It's going to look at whatever production marketing records you have, and it's going to try to extrapolate to give you a 12-month total for whatever months we're missing in the year. If you've got some marketings in 2013, they'll fill in the front end of 2013. If you didn't start until 2014, they're going to start with whatever numbers you have for 2014, and they'll fill in the front end of 2014. So it's basically an extrapolation process. Two options are available. If you enroll at least in 2015, then next year you're eligible for what USDA calls the bump. And this is an across-the-board increase that would apply to every producer who's enrolled in the program, every dairy operation that's enrolled in the program, and gives them this across-the-board increase in their production history, where that bump is defined by what happened to U.S. milk production in the last year. For 2015, the bump is 0.87%. So in other words, just a little less than a 1% increase. And if you enroll for 2015, your 2014 base, perhaps it was your 2013 marketings, will just be multiplied by 1.0087, and that becomes your new production history. One thing to keep in mind is if you do not enroll in 2015, you do not get the bump, and you will never get that 2015 bump. If you defer enrollment in 2015 and you enroll in 2016, you can get the 2016 bump, but you can't go backwards and pick up the one that you lost for 2015. And you might ask yourself, is getting that 0.87% increase in my production history worth the $100 that I have to pay at least at a minimum for 2015, even if you didn't want to get coverage under the program? The next part, once you've established that total quantity that's eligible, then you get to decide what your covered production history will be. Basically what this says is you can enroll between 25 and 90% of your production history going in 5% increments, 25, 30, 35, 40. That'll become real obvious when Mark demonstrates the tool. But it basically says you can't cover all of your milk, although you can cover a whole bunch of it, and you get to decide how much of that you want to cover in the each year when you make your enrollment. So that percentage times your production history defines a total quantity of milk, total pounds of milk, and of course that will determine the total premiums and potential benefits in combination with the dollar per hundredweight premium or the dollar per hundredweight benefit. You are also going to be looking at this new concept of that they're formally calling the actual dairy producer margin. John will talk about that. Mark will illustrate what some of those numbers look like. Again, this is a kind of an income over feed cost. It's fairly literally the gross income from selling milk minus the cost of feeding not just the cows, but a complete dairy herd, young stock, dry cows, a complete dairy herd. And this cost of feeding is going to be determined entirely, completely, solely by USDA prices for milk, corn, soybean meal, and hay. And I want to emphasize, although it says actual dairy producer margin, it isn't actually any dairy producer's margin. It's not your margin, it's not Mark's margin, it's not Farmer Brown's margin in Montana. It is a nationally representative number, one number that's supposed to be kind of one size fits all, that is an indicator nationally of how farmers are doing, hopefully. And you probably want to look and think about whether or not your experience on your farm looks similar to this margin result that comes from this formula. And I think you'll find that they tend to move together. They go up and down together. But I'd be amazed if you ever found one occasion where it was exactly the same number. And so part of your process is going to be thinking about, what does that mean to me? And I'll just say that the extent to which it's important to you probably depends on whether or not your objective is to simply maximize your expected net return from MPP dairy, or whether or not you're really trying to make this part of a more complicated risk management program. What's this program going to cost me? It's going to cost you at a minimum $100 a year. It's called an administrative fee. I believe that $100 fee will be due when you register, when you submit your coverage election form, and every year thereafter you'll get billed this $100 administrative fee. In addition, you could be subject to premiums. If you choose the minimal level of coverage, $4 per hundredweight, you will find the premium is zero. But after that, the premiums are presented in what they call two tiers, where the tiers are differentiated by the quantity of milk that's enrolled. This is your covered production history. So it's not how big your farm is, it's not how big your base is, it's not how big your production history is, it's how much milk did you decide to register for the program in that year. The first 4 million pounds per year gets Tier 1 premiums. Soon as you log 1 pound more, those additional pounds, everything over 4 million pounds per year, is going to be charged a much higher premium, Tier 2. In addition, for this current registration period, there is a 25% discount that only applies to Tier 1 for the coverage levels of 750 and below. If you choose coverage that will require a premium payment, you have two options. You can pay your premium obligation in full at the time of registration, and in a year where incomes are high, when you have a good year, it may make sense to do that, because I'm pretty sure this will be an deductible expense. Or you can pay 25% of the premium on February 1st of next year, and the remaining 75% on June 1st. When you see the decision tool, you'll see that we've got the premium calculations built in. This graph gives you a sense of what those look like. Of course, you can see the actual numbers in a table, but I thought for presentation purposes, this would give you maybe a little bit more of a visual appreciation of how large these premiums are and how quickly they increase. And you can see the green bars, of course, apply to Tier 1. The lighter green, the darker green is the discounted 25% discount. That's a pretty flat increase. You can get up to $6 before you really start to see much increase, and even $6.50 isn't a particularly tall bar. And then, of course, it starts to increase up towards $8. When you're looking at Tier 2, you know, the first few levels, 455, don't have a great deal of slope on them, but they start to increase more perceptibly towards 650, and then there's a big jump when you get in the highest levels, 7, 750, and 8. And I think when Mark demonstrates the tool, he'll show you that making an $8 choice in Tier 2 is a far more serious bit of business than making an $8 choice in Tier 1. Once you are ready to select a particular coverage, USDA has a form where you say, this is the dollar per hundredweight coverage I want. It's called the coverage level threshold. This is $4 to $8 in 50-cent increments. And you choose the coverage level percentage. This is at 25 to 90%, again, in 5% increments. Those two together define the coverage that you select for your dairy operation. If you're in a situation where you have more than one owner, or perhaps a shareholder if you're in a corporate situation, every owner of that farm, every legal owner of that farm, must agree to the same coverage level and indicate that by signing the appropriate FSA form, which is called CCC 782. It's a piece of paper printed on both sides. It's not especially complicated, But the decision, what to pick, is going to require some thought, and that's why we've got the decision tool, and everybody has to agree. So if I've got a 25% stake in a farm, I can't just make a decision for my 25%. Every owner has to agree to the same thing. You get to change your choice every year, every time there's a new sign-up, unless one of two things. If there's a death or a retirement of the owner or one of the owners, if the business dissolves, you can terminate your participation in the program during the year in which you're registered. If you decide you don't want to terminate it, but you don't want to be in it the following years, you still better tell USDA, because they're going to send you that $100 bill for the coming year if you don't tell them about the fact that there was a change due to death, retirement, or dissolution. On the other side, if there's a new operation that begins in the year after the enrollment period is closed, you can go to FSA and demonstrate that you're a new operation, and if you do so within 90 days, you can enroll in the program even after the enrollment period has started. What USDA calls catastrophic coverage, or CAT coverage, is defined as $4 per hundredweight on 90% of your production, and that is your default. So every year, your coverage election gets set back to this catastrophic coverage, and if you don't want it to be CAT coverage, you have to go in and establish what your desired coverage election is. So if you signed up for $8 at 50%, don't assume that that will apply to the next year. They'll dial it back to the CAT coverage, the default coverage, unless you go in and specifically change what you want them to do. I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of the basic design of this program, and I'm happy to turn the mic over now to Jim Putnam and John Newton. Thank you.
Thanks for that great overview, Andy. Obviously, there's some moving pieces here that we're going to have to get our heads around in order to move forward with the analysis. So thanks again. With that, we're going to move over to John Newton at the University of Illinois, and I think he's going to give us some tools and some analysis to begin to take these program parameters and apply them to decision making. So John, go ahead.
All right, can everybody hear me?
We can hear you well.
All right, great. Well, thanks for having me, James, and Farm Credit East. I look forward to detailing how we come up with these forecasts. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do is a little bit of self-promotion. Here at Illinois, yesterday we released the ARC and PLC decision tools. It's under the Agricultural Policy Analysis System. So it's a one-stop shop to go and get your ARC and PLC information. Then we also have NAP specialty products coming, as well as the dairy decision tool that we're talking about today. And those are available at fsa.usapass.com. So MPP, as Andy said, it's a new way to think about a government safety net program. No longer do we have a target price support program based off of a Boston Class 1 price of milk. Instead, we're looking at a margin. And it's not your margin, it's a national margin based on these national prices. So when farmers are thinking about participation, they really have two decisions. The first one is, how much milk do I protect? As Andy said, you can go from 25 to 90%. And then the second decision is, what margin level do I want to protect? From 4 to 8 in 50-cent increments. Now this is the national margin. It's not your farm level margin. So you do have to sometimes think about some basis considerations to really understand what price floor you're protecting. But let's continue. If you look at the different coverage options, there are 113 possible combinations. So how are dairy farmers going to navigate this new safety net? How do they know what coverage option works for them? Well, to help make that decision, we've developed a decision tool that looks at price probabilities and forecasts to help you understand what's the probability that 750 at 90% is going to pay. Do I need that level of protection? Are we moving into a bad year? The decision tool can help you make an informed risk management decision. And if you look back in the past, you really needed something to help you make an informed decision. Simply electing $4.90% isn't going to cut it. That's just cap coverage, and if you look over the last 14 years, it triggered twice. We have 67% in 2009, and in 2012, cap coverage only triggered 33% of the time. So it's really these higher coverage levels that have a higher probability of payments. So thinking about where you want to be in a bad year and where you want to be in a good year is what we're trying to help farmers think about. And so how do we develop an expectation of where these margins are going to go during the coverage period? Well, there are a lot of places that dairy farmers can get a price forecast. Probably one from their cooperative. I know several Federal Order guys send out price forecasts. Risk management firms certainly are going to send out a price forecast. Academics will have price forecasts on, the milk and feed commodities. Financial institutions like banks may have a price forecast. And then we also have futures markets. So we have futures markets for milk and feed. Corn, soybean meal, Class 3 and Class 4 milk. So I like to think of futures markets as the best available tool because there are so many players in the game. You have people that are long and people that are short in the futures market, and they're making the decision on what price to purchase a futures contract based on what kind of information they have. So futures are generally considered to be an unbiased estimator of what's going to happen. Now that's not always the case. So generally futures are wrong, but they're not consistently off in one direction or another. That's what I mean, they're unbiased. So it's the best information we have as far as figuring out what direction this margin may be heading. And as Mark will demonstrate later, the tool we've developed is pretty good at giving you that indication. So let's think about this. Let's think about how we're going to do this. So what we need to forecast a NAS corn price. Well, there's no NAS corn price traded on the board in Chicago, but there is a CME corn contract traded. And if you see here, the orange is the CME price, the blue is the NAS price. They move pretty closely together. There is some basis there, but we have confidence that we can use the CME prices to help forecast what these NAS corn prices are going to be, because it's the NAS prices, the national average prices of feed, that are going to be used in the MPP formula. So we're going to use the futures market to help forecast these NAS prices. So that's NAS corn. Soybean meal, we need to find a relationship between the CME soybean meal price and the AMS Central Illinois soybean meal price. Again, the blue here is the AMS price and the orange is the CME price. The red is the basis, and there is some basis, but these prices follow each other very closely. So we feel confident that we can use the CME prices to forecast the AMS prices. What about milk? We know that the all milk price reflects Class 1 milk, Class 2 milk, Class 3 milk, Class 4 milk, and probably premiums. But we can look at the markets for Class 3 and Class 4 milk to help think about where the all milk price is going to go. And if you look at the price series, the blue, the dark blue is the NAS all milk price, light blue is the Class 3, orange is the Class 4. And these prices move with each other. And that's what you'd expect. Class 1 milk is based off an advanced pricing factors for Class 3 and 4, so sometimes Class 3 will drive Class 1, and sometimes Class 4 will drive 1. So really, the all milk price represents the upper envelope here of these Class 3 and Class 4 prices. And that's what we find in the data, is that the all milk price has a strong relationship with the CME prices. So again, we feel confident that we can use the CME milk futures contracts to help forecast the NAS all milk price. So we use a series of regressions that use the CME prices as inputs to forecast as outputs the NAS and AMS prices that we need in order to determine the probability that MPP would make a payment. So for the all milk price, we use Class 3 and Class 4 milk. We use some lag prices, and then we also include some seasonal effects. For corn, we use the CME corn price, and then we also bring in some lag prices. Hay, that's the biggest one, alfalfa hay. There's no futures contract for alfalfa hay. So how are we going to forecast alfalfa hay? We bring in the other two feed ingredients, and then dairy farmers are big purchasers of alfalfa hay. So we bring in the milk price as a signal for what alfalfa hay prices may do, and then we also bring in lagged alfalfa hay prices. So all of those prices combined help us to point alfalfa hay in the direction we think it might be moving. And finally, we have soybean meal, which I demonstrated earlier. We use the CME prices to help forecast that Central Illinois soybean meal price. So what we're doing is we're taking CME prices and we're transforming them into the NAS and AMS prices we need to make informed risk management decisions under MPP. But the fancy part that we do, the stuff that I worked on my dissertation at Ohio State, was how do we tie all of these prices together? What's the probability that we're going to see a corn price decrease followed by a soybean meal price increase? Or what's the probability that we're going to see a corn price increase followed by a milk price increase? We need to know how all of these commodities move together in order to develop a more informed forecast of how the MPP margin is going to move over the coverage period. So that's what we do. And you can look here, we have corn and soybean meal prices, and they're correlated. Corn and soybean meal tend to move together. What about milk and corn? There's correlation there. And that's what we're trying to pick up. We want to know how these milk prices move with the feed prices and how the two feed prices move together, so that when we're trying to estimate and put together an accurate forecast, we're capturing those commodities' co-movements. So here, let's look again. Let's look at milk and soybean meal. And again, there's a relationship. And that's what we bring in the model, is a way to tie all of that together so that we're making an accurate and informed risk management decision and helping dairy farmers understand the direction that these margins could be moving. So let's think about how we're going to do this. So the futures market has a price. So we know what the futures price for Class 3 milk is. But how do we know the uncertainty around that? Well, futures contracts also have derivative instruments of options. So an option, a put or a call, has an associated premium in order to lock in a particular strike price. And the premium provides implicit market information about the expected distribution of commodity prices. So here, I'm forecasting September 2015 corn prices. Now this is probably a week old, but the market said, look, there's a high probability that corn prices could be at or below $4 for next year. And we determined that using the futures price and the option premium to derive a probability distribution of that corn price. So the method we use is a binomial option pricing formula, and we use that to derive the implied volatility. And that helps us construct distributions of the milk and feed prices. So again, here's a distribution for corn. On the right is a distribution for soybean meal price. So from this distribution, we can assess the likely probability that in September 2015, we're going to have soybean meal above $500. And as you can see in the PDF, it's a pretty low probability. So if it's a low probability that we're going to have high soybean meal prices and a low probability that we're going to have corn above $5, farmers need to know that, because those two prices are key components of the MPP dairy formula. The other components are milk. So what's the probability that we're going to have milk under $20? Well, if you look at these two probability distributions, there's a pretty large probability that milk prices are going to be below $20 next September. Now, this is just September. We do this for all of the months for the entire coverage period. So we're constructing probability distributions for over 48 different prices. But what does that mean? Well, we're going to take milk probability distributions and we're going to subtract away probability distributions on the feed. And what is that going to leave us? Well, it's going to leave us with a probability distribution of the MPP margin. And that's what we're interested in. That's the final result that we want. How likely is it that next September the MPP margin is going to be below $8? Because that's the trigger price. And how likely is it that this margin is going to trigger at farmer-selected coverage options? So when the tool, farmers can select their unique coverage options and then assess the probability that the margins are going to trigger payments under those coverage options. And if they do, what could you expect to receive? So we use this probability distribution in order to do that. And we construct probabilities for every month of the coverage period, and then we group them into the bi-monthly periods that you need to determine MPP benefits. Really sophisticated technique that we're using here. So here's an example. We take all the prices that we're forecasting, and this is what the market looks like for the next year. It looks good today. 2014 looks good, but we're starting to see the market anticipate declines in dairy prices. This graph is driven by declines in dairy prices. Feed prices are relatively stable. We have a great crop this year. So feed prices aren't what's driving this decline in the margin. It's all based on milk. So understanding the potential risks is what we help farmers do so they can make an informed risk management decision. Now, I'd like to do one more advertisement. Today on Farm.Daily, I'm going to put a post out that talks about an additional factor to consider, and that is whether or not a dairy farmer should consider his or her own basis. So what is the difference between their cash price and the MPP dairy margin, and what are the implications of thinking about that? And you can find the post today at farm.daily.illinois to read more about what exactly basis means when using MPP dairy. And that's all I have. James, if we'd like to continue to Mark to demo the tool.
All right, John, great work there. A lot of moving pieces here in terms of the different markets that are playing into the margin here. And looks like you've done some great work there to at least give us a tool that we can incorporate all that information. So with that, we're going to transition over to Mark Stephenson, and I believe that Mark is going to take us through the actual decision tool. Mark, take it.
All right, thanks. Just to, first of all, check and make sure, Jim, you can hear me and you can see my screen.
Yes on both.
Okay.
Got your tool, your screen here from that says the decision tool for MPP, and you're coming through loud and clear.
Very good. Well, before I actually get into the tool, I wanted to just kind of walk backwards in time a little bit and look to see what sort of strategies might be revealed, particularly for those that Andy talked about, where you would say, I would like to maximize the benefits that I could get under this program. And if we go backward in time, let's say to 2005, we're showing on this particular graphic or chart what the margins were over here in the blue bars. And you'll notice that this was a slightly better than average year for dairy. The average margin has been about $8.50 a hundredweight over the last decade or more. And this was a year in which there was not a single month that would have been below an $8 margin. And so there would have been no payments. The example that I'm showing here would be for a farm that was going to protect 4 million pounds of production history, and it's about a 170 cow farm producing 23,000 pounds of milk per cow. So optimally in 2005, this farm would have selected the catastrophic level of coverage because there were no possibility of payments. And they would have paid $100, and that would have been the best that they could have done in this year under this program. In 2006, those margins had deteriorated somewhat, and in fact, in the middle of the year, from April through about August, we had a sort of sag in the margins that would have triggered some payments at levels of protection that were $7 or above. And you can see in the table up near the top here that at the $7 level, you would have had about $2,000 worth of payments and about nearly $8,000 worth of premium that would have been paid. At the $8 level, you would have had as much as $18,000, almost $19,000 in payments received, and you would have paid about $17,000 worth of premiums. So that would have been a net positive. And in this year of 2006, the best thing that a producer could have done of this size would have been about an $8 level of coverage. 2007 was a great year. This was a year in which we had margins that were at, near, or above $14 a hundredweight for half of the year, and not a single month was below an $8 level. So a year like this, catastrophic coverage would have been all that a producer would have wanted to do, at least in hindsight. 2008, the margins had deteriorated, but only with the combination of November and December as a pair of valued months would we have had a level that would have been under an $8 coverage payment. And at that $8 level, you would have received fairly modest $2,000, not enough to cover your premium costs. So again, catastrophic coverage would have been the best that you could have done. But now, let's remember what follows 2008, and every audience that I've spoken with seems to remember that very well, and that was 2009. This was a year where we had margins that had declined almost to a $2 level in June and below $3 for a couple of months. We had margins that would have triggered payments at every level of coverage you could have had, including catastrophic. So at the $100 administrative fee and no premium cost for catastrophic coverage, this particular farm would have received about $15,000 in payments. And you can see that those payments would have increased all the way up to the $8 level of coverage, where this 4 million pounds of milk covered would have received about $124,000 worth of payments, which would have netted this farm about $106,000. That was the best you could have done under this particular program. I think it's important for farms to try to think about their own situation and maybe map what this national margin level means to them. In other words, at what level do you really need coverage or protection? And one of the places that we can do it with some degree of ease is in a year like this, we can look at how much MILC would have paid to this farm, the milk income loss contracts. And this farm is larger than the 2.985 million pound cap on production that we would have received milk payments for. But if they had picked the best starting month, they could have received a maximum of nearly $45,000 in 2009, certainly a help. And you'll also see that at a coverage level around $5 or $5.50 in this new program, we have a net benefit to producers that sort of mimics what MILC would have done. Anything above that would have paid more. Anything below that would have returned less. So if the farms felt like MILC provided adequate level of protection to their operation, then you might want to think about a $5 or $5.50 level of coverage, particularly for farms that are producing less than 4 million pounds of production history. At that 4 million pounds, by the way, all of the premiums are under the or are within the first tier of coverage levels. 2010, we had a rebound in the markets. It wasn't a really strong year, but it was a year that we would have received a few payments at the $7.50 or $8 level, but neither of those levels would have been enough to cover the premium costs that were paid. So in 2010, we're back to $4 being optimal. 2011 was basically the same story. Catastrophic coverage would have been the most beneficial for farms. 2012, however, when we had the feed price problems and margins declined significantly, here again you can see that the $8 level of coverage would have been the best that the farm could have done, although they would have received payments that would have been net positive at any level of coverage. 2013 was more of a mixed year. This was a year that at an $8 level we would have had payments. And by the way, those payments are showing up in the green caps on these column bars over here. The blue is showing you what the margins actually were. So this is a good opportunity, I think, to demonstrate exactly what this does in the way of smoothing out the income stream for farms. In the months in which you would have had a loss of net benefits or net returns on your operation, income over feed costs, we are paying a fair amount under these programs in some particular years. And even 2013 was a year where we could have received significant payments. The net positive benefit at the highest level would have been at the $8 level return. So if we look backward over a decade and say what was the optimal strategy, you can see that 2005 was catastrophic, 2006 was $8, 7 catastrophic, $8, and so forth. And here it becomes apparent, I think, that at least for these farms that are in Tier 1 level of coverage, that the optimal strategy seems to be either all the way up or all the way down, depending on the year. And the real question might be, how can we determine what that might be? Because we don't get to look backwards in most cases. We have to look forward and try to guess what the year is going to be like. That's partly what this decision tool does. You'll notice, though, that the income stream for this farm under an optimal strategy over this decade would have returned something like $225,000 to the farm, which averaged about $128 per cow per year, or 56 cents per hundredweight on all milk produced. So truly a pretty strong benefit. I would like to jump over now and see if I can run a demo on our website of this decision tool. This is what the program looks like when you come into the home page, which I can show you here. And under the home page, we have a variety of tabs that can be chosen. Let's go to the margin protection program. You'll see a number of things that can be downloaded over here, including accessing this decision tool, and that's what we're going to do. When you access the tool, the first page that comes up is showing you a couple of disclaimer notes. One of them is up here at the top, and it's just reminding us that if Congress doesn't, for some reason, pass a budget and we actually fall back into sequestration again, then this would be considered a non-essential program, like our state parks and many other things were. And the money that would be available to be paid to dairy producers, if a payment should be required during that period of time, would be reduced. So you just need to realize that that's a possibility if we should fall into sequestration. I think that's a pretty small probability, but it exists. The other disclaimer down here just says that we've done our best to provide a tool for you, but your decisions are still your own. And you have to agree to this before you can get in. But once you get into the tool, this is what you see. And this is a graphic that John had showed you, but this is a live graphic and is updated daily on the website. And the first choice that dairy producers have to make in this particular year, and perhaps in years going forward, is a choice between the margin protection program and livestock gross margin for dairy. We provide access both for this decision tool for margin protection program and the tool that Brian Gould has, the LGM analyzer, and you can flip back and forth between those. So you can make a run to look at what your opportunities would be under current levels of livestock gross margin for dairy and what they would be with a margin protection program, and that may help you make that particular decision. We've been looking at the examples of a farm with a 4 million pound history, so I'm going to recreate that over here. When you come into this program the first time, the default is for this probability table, And there are two, or not probability table, it's forecast graph. And there are actually two things that let you look at the forecast margin or the market in the year ahead. This particular graph is showing in the black line the calculations that John was talking about for the expected margin in each of the months. And those months go out far enough so that on July 1st of next year, when you have the beginning of a decision period to make and register for the program, that you'll be able to see the full calendar year ahead. And of course, that calendar year is going to be, well, it's currently January 15th through December 15th. You can see what these margins are. This green band in here is indicating that there is a 25% probability that those margins could be above our expected levels, and the red band shows you a 25% probability that the values could be below that. And the blue area, of course, marks the coverage levels that can be attained under the program. Realize, if you will, that there's still 25% probability that margins could be up here above the green band, or 25% probability they could fall into this area below the red bands. So as I mentioned, every day this data is updated, every day that CME trades, and it was last updated last night with yesterday's data. And when we have the next actual margins that will be posted after our ag prices report, this month will roll off the slide, and August moves into this position, and January will slide onto the calendar of 2016, clear to the right-hand side. So we have two ways of looking at the market table. One of them is this forecast graph, and the other is a probability table. Andy had indicated that we'll be averaging the values over 2-month pairs, and that's what's shown on here, our expected values over 2-month pairs over the course of the year. And we also use the information that's available in the distributions John talked about to say, but what's the probability prices could fall into the level that an $8 coverage would provide some payments, or $7.50 or $7, or all the way down to $4. You'll notice that in 2014, we do get to choose those last 4 months of the year, September, October pair, November, December pair, and there is essentially right now a 0% chance that margins are going to fall into any levels of payment. In 2015, however, those margins are beginning to deteriorate a little bit. They fall down into the relatively high $10 range, and they begin to pick up some probabilities that we could fall below an $8 margin. It's not big. The other day when I was looking at this, this was about 18% probability over here in the November-December time period that we could have margins in the $8 range. So feed prices are falling even faster than milk prices are on futures markets, and this probability has declined. So those are the two areas that you look at in terms of forecasting the market. The other major section of the graph is where we get down here to actually select coverage levels. And this is going to default to the year ahead when we would be choosing, in this case, a 2015 coverage. For this farm that's 4 million pounds, we also have the bump calculated into the amount of milk that can be covered. And at the 90% level of coverage, including the bump up in the amount of milk covered, the fees and premiums at an $8 level are now $17,349. And you can see that that goes all the way down through the various coverage levels. There is an expected payment at each of these levels, and this is based on what's the likelihood that we could fall into an $8 level, and if so, how much would have been paid if that happened. And you'll see here what the expected payments are that we're forecasting. If you subtract the fees and premiums from the expected payment, you'll also see that an expected net return is being shown over here on the right-hand column. That particular column would indicate that if you were trying to maximize your profits on the farm as a strategy for using this, that probably the catastrophic level of coverage is what you would select. I do want to show you that as we've now selected a level of coverage, I'll select something just a bit more interesting. There's a button that shows up over here on the right-hand side that says download the FSA election forms. And if you click on that, it will remind you of what you're currently selecting, and that is 90% of production history at 650 level. And if that's right, you can click this button and the program will generate the election forms that you see over here. Let's see if I can enlarge this for you. Sorry about that. There is a cover page on the letter, and then we get into the forms that Andy mentioned, the 781 form, which is the establishment of your production history. But we also generate this election coverage form, which is the 782 form, and it will bring over the selections that you made at 650 and 90% in this case. You can fill in the rest of the forms and take it into the FSA office to be registered. And the premium calculation is listed here, the amount that's due by February 1st, and the amount that would be due no later than June 1st. Excuse me. So here's the program. That's interesting, I think, in and of itself, and what you would be using the program for in the current time period. But we can also go back in time and look at different periods of history that we've had. So I'm going to go back to the 2008 year. If I go back to the 2008 year and look at the forecast graph, this is standing at a point in time that was at the end of September 2007, and we're seeing what the futures markets were forecasting at that point in time. Actually, this graph looks amazingly similar to what we're seeing today in the marketplace, and that would be a slight increase forecast over the next couple of months in the expected value of the margin, and then declining over a period of time, but not really getting down into the area where we would expect to see a high probability of payments. So one thing we can do with the historic data now, though, is to be able to say, I want to see what actually did happen, not just what the futures markets were forecasting. And when we click on this line, or this box up here, you'll notice a blue line that shows up. These were the actual margins that the market gave us compared to those that the market was forecasting as much as 18 months in advance. And I think when you look at this, you might say, well, it wasn't perfect, but it was reasonably good. The one question I guess I would have is it too wrong to have helped us make an effective decision for coverage? So if we go over and just select coverage for this historic time period, you can see that the fees and premiums are being generated here. Those would be known with certainty. And the expected payments were generated here based on the futures markets and the expected net returns. This would have suggested that the catastrophic level, much like our graphs are forecasting today, would be the optimal choice. But now we can actually look and see what did happen to this farm. And you'll notice that there were some payments that were made because it's not just reflecting the fees and premiums. At the $8 level, it looks like there were about $2,000 worth of payments this farm would have received, but not enough to cover the full fees and premiums. Indeed, the best level of choice would have been down here at the catastrophic level. So that was 2008 based on a forecast from September of 2007. Let's move forward one year to where we would be making a choice for 2009 coverage at September of 2008. And let's go back here to the margin graph. This time you'll notice that the markets were already experiencing margins that were pretty close to the coverage level at the time we were making decisions. And the futures markets were forecasting, in fact, that we were going to have a decline in this margin value that would take us well into the $8 level of coverage or even below that. Let's take a look and see what actually did happen. As you can see by the blue line, the margins were significantly lower than what was being forecast. And one of the reasons for that was this 2009 time period was a global recession. A global recession that we really didn't know much of anything about at September of 2009 or 2008 when we had to make a decision. We didn't realize that we were going to have a collapse in the housing market or bank failures that were going to be taking place. But the markets were already suspicious that things were happening and that the margins were not likely to be great. Now, if we make a look at the select coverage level, I think the important question is, even though the futures markets did not get the depth of the margin collapse forecast very well at that point, did they give you enough information to at least make a reasonable decision? So in select coverage, you'll notice that the expected payments are now fairly positive, and the expected net returns would have suggested that you probably would not just want catastrophic coverage, even though they were forecasting that that would have been a positive net benefit to this farm, but you probably would want to buy up. In fact, the best place on this would have been forecast at the $8 level. And of course, in hindsight, we can look and see that what this farm would have actually received was about $106,000, much more on net than we were expecting, but this would have still been the correct level of choice to make. So it didn't lead us to a wrong decision. Now, I do want to show one other thing. I've been looking at this for about 175 cow operation. Because those Tier 2 premiums are so much more expensive, this makes a real difference depending on the size of the farm. If I simply add a digit up here to show 40 million pounds of production history, I think that's about a 1,700 cow farm, you'll now notice that the fees and premiums are approaching $500,000 a year at the $8 level of protection. And you will also notice that while we would be expecting quite a lot in the way of payments, the forecast would have been negative. In other words, the fees and premiums more than we expected the payment to be. It would have still, in hindsight, been the very best place and in actual revenue sense, but this would have suggested that maybe $650 would have been a more appropriate level of coverage for a larger farm. And you will see that we got a significant amount of net revenue from that choice level. In fact, it approaches $700,000. While this is not quite, but nearly $100,000 more, the fees and premiums were more like $300,000 more at the $8 level of coverage. So you have to have the courage of your convictions, I think, on a large farm to buy all the way up at the $8 level of coverage. Just one other thing that I haven't demonstrated, and that is that you can choose different percentage levels of coverage, and it does make a difference to fees and premiums, expected payments, and so forth. So that, I think, is most of what I wanted to show you about the tool, but I had a couple of final slides I wanted to demonstrate for you. So if we didn't take the advantage of this hindsight, the optimal strategy, so this is something more like an advanced strategy. Can I pick something that looks pretty reasonable? And in doing that, this farm would have had a couple of years in which the payments would have been wrong. We wouldn't have picked the most optimal strategy, but you would have still had a significant payment on milk per cow, or on per hundredweight of milk sold, or on a per cow basis. So the tool, I think, is helping make a pretty good decision if indeed what you want to do is to optimize the amount of payments that are available for you. If you wanted to pick something more like a risk management strategy, you might say, you know, I've determined that my farm is vulnerable and I don't have enough equity in there to feel comfortable possibly exposing myself to another 2009. I would like to have a $6.50 level of coverage every year. Well, now you can see you do have more premiums that you're paying on years in which you don't have any payments netted to you. But in the years like 2009, 2012, or indeed 2013, you would have received a significant amount of payments, much more than the total amount of the premiums. So again, this farm had a pretty positive net benefit, but not as good as picking the optimal strategy or indeed the advanced strategy through the tool. There are two places where you can access this dairy tool. One of them is at our website, which is dairymarkets.org, and the other is at the Farm Service Agency website, fsa.usda.gov. It's exactly the same tool running on exactly the same computer. So please feel free to access that. And with that, Jim, I would wrap up my part of the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Mark. Again, it's rather mind-boggling to me how you've used the computer technology and the market information from the futures and the various correlations and so forth to put together a really powerful tool to walk through that. And I'll at least identify Andy in this category, but I remember folks having to do all of this in a hurry in a very manual sort of way back with the whole herd buyout. And wouldn't it have been nice to have a tool like this back then that would really allow you to run multiple scenarios and really factor in a lot of information. So nice job to all three of you, both in the development of the tool set here and your presentation of it this morning. I've asked Christy to open up the phone lines for all three presenters. Andy, I'm going to ask you to kind of direct traffic as to who you think ought to answer any given question. So I'll read the question, and Andy will tag the person that ought to answer it. So the first question is the production history based on any 12 months in 2011-2013 or the highest calendar year? Thanks.
Excellent question. USDA is going to be using calendar year information for existing producers, but also for new operations. So if you're an existing producer and you write down your 2011, 2012, and so on, those will be calendar year 2011, you just pick the highest number. If you are somebody who's got a partial year, you're a new operation, and say you started in April of 2014, they'll take your commercial marketings for April through September or October, whatever the most recent would be, and they'll fill out the ends. They'll fill out the months before April, they'll fill out the months after September or October in their extrapolation process, but they're always going to be looking at a January through December year.
Next question. Are these expected margins the same projections as the expected margins in LGM dairy? Of course, using the all milk price and not an actual milk and feed price that can be used in LGM dairy.
They are not, but I'm going to invite John to just talk a little bit about the comparisons and whether or not you could use LGM dairy the same or a little bit more of those subtleties, but they are not identical by any means. John Newton, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I had myself muted. Sorry about that. Thanks for bringing that up. They aren't exactly the same. Now, they're similar. So what LGM does is it does a simulation technique just like we're doing, but LGM does not assume any type of relationship between the milk and feed commodities, whereas here we found that correlation and we're bringing that together. Then LGM Dairy uses an average of 3 days of futures prices, whereas ours is updated every single day using just the prior day's closing prices. So there's some differences there. And then LGM Dairy's doing a simulation on a gross margin, which is the difference between a class 3 price. We're doing an all milk price, and then they allow farmers to change their ration elements under LGM Dairy whereas here we're using fixed rations of corn, soybean meal, and alfalfa, and then the LGM feed commodities are the CME, corn, and soybean meal. So while they're similar, they're really apples and oranges. And the thing that's different that farmers and everyone should really understand is that LGM dairy is a market-based instrument, whereas MPP dairy, the premiums are fixed. It's not tied to market anticipated risk in milk and feed markets. So there will be times when LGM will offer you a higher price floor than what you could get out of MPP. But in a down market, the market will not allow you to hedge high prices using LGM dairy because LGM dairy is based on the market, whereas MPP will always offer from $4 to $8 coverage at those fixed premium rates. So that's the big difference between the two.
Okay, I'm going to go to Carolyn Huff of our Farm Credit East team for the next question. Carolyn is a senior tax specialist and consultant, works out of our Dayville, Connecticut office. And the question is, what are the taxable status of both the expense and benefit portions that would apply to the MPP program?
Mark, do you have a good answer to that question?
No, I'm going to ask Carolyn Huff to answer that one, Andy.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you.
We're going to take the heat on this one. Carolyn, are you there?
Yeah, so you're asking in terms of deductibility of the payments and income for the receipt of benefit?
That's how I infer the question, Carolyn.
Okay, then I guess I would feel pretty safe in saying that normally, if similar to an insurance program or any other kind of premium, those would be deductible as a business expense, and then whatever benefit you receive, just as the MILC payments, they were fully reportable as income to the farm.
And for Schedule F filers, all of this would flow through Schedule F, correct?
Correct. Because you're supporting your normal income price, so that's a Schedule F item.
I hope that answers the question, but if the individual who submitted that has a follow-up, just text that in and we'll come back to Carolyn. Thanks, Carolyn. Next question is both kind of a comment and a question, I think. The tools are very impressive, no question. Are you concerned that the probability analysis provides a degree of certainty to producers that will impact production and expansion decisions? In other words, will the tool result in significantly more production than would otherwise be the case by taking away uncertainty? Wow, that's quite a question. Have fun with that, Andy.
Well, I'm going to take a shot at it, but I know that both John and Mark have thought about this a lot and may want to embellish on it. But there's kind of two parts here. One is the contribution of helping people think about what might be coming down the road, to just sort of maybe sharpen up or present these market expectations in kind of a new way, and I think a way that is really very interesting, even if you never use the MPP dairy program. And so there's just that information by itself going to make a difference. And the second part is, will the benefit payments make a difference? And that question's come up a lot. And I think many of us have the same question for MILC. If the way the market works is when you have a down market, it puts pressure on supply and pushes supply down, it stimulates demand and pulls consumption up, and the two actions together start to tighten the market and gives you some lift on price. That's fundamental economics. Many of us thought that MILC had that characteristic, but maybe didn't result in too much of it because the MILC payments were limited. Well, now we're talking about a program that is open to much more of the full spectrum of U.S. milk production. And if the government is coming in and sending farmers checks in periods of stress, that obviously is the whole point of that, is to keep milk into production, to prevent farmers from going out of business. And so you cut off the leg of one of those normal market adjustment mechanisms because you've decided the market is a little too harsh. Well, the flip side of that coin is you could perpetuate low price periods. And if that's the way that would play out, you could end up not really creating some kind of new surplus. It wouldn't necessarily stimulate more milk production, but it would prevent milk production from declining when the market was signaling that it didn't quite know what to do with it. And if you get into these perpetual or protracted low margin periods, that could become pretty expensive into the billion-dollar category. And whether or not that scenario plays out depends on two things. Do you have a big sign-up at a meaningful level, and did the market tank in a way that really makes those benefit payments big? So we'll see whether or not we run into that kind of trouble, but it's a very, very legitimate question. John or Mark, you have other thoughts or better thoughts to suggest?
Can I chip in?
Certainly.
You know, the first thing is when you look at this and you think about whether or not a dairy farmer is going to take the market information rationally and choose to maximize expected benefits. And we've done case studies, and a lot of farmers actually don't. You know, they're buying based on what they think they can afford. And so even though the tool may say, hey, 650, 90% maximizes your return, we've sat with farmers and say, you know what, yeah, but I feel more comfortable at 550. And so you may not see farmers using it as strategically. But then again, I look back at the MILC program, and there was a ton of strategy used there. Farmers were, you know, the large dairy producers in picking their start month were like 90% accurate in picking the start month that was going to pay the most money in the form of an MILC check. So it's hard to say what will happen as far as dairy farmers using this strategically. And then whether or not there's a price effect, I think there's two components. One, there's a supply component that Andy talked about, but there's also consumption. And so if people are consuming more dairy products across the world, then we may have higher prices, and this program may never trigger. So I tend to stay away from getting too far ahead of myself there.
And I'll offer the third opinion. The third opinion is that, you know, there's always been a risk-reward trade-off. In a risky environment, we expect that prices have to be higher to reward us for accepting that risk. And if this program, like any other program, does what it should do, and that is to reduce risk for us, we would also expect that the rewards are going to be generally lower over time period. And in fact, if this could take all of the risk out of producing milk, I mean, I'd milk cows. But I don't think it does that, and I'm not going to be milking cows any day soon. However, I do think it does reduce risk, and it will probably reduce the reward over a long run to dairy producers.
Okay. Love it when we have dueling dairy economists tying us back to our Economics 101. Good discussion there. Next question. Are there payment limits?
No, there are no payment limits in the conventional sense. You can get limitations in two forms. One is there something about me that makes me ineligible to get a payment? And so the typical thing that we see in agriculture is income eligibility. I make too much money off of the farm, or my income is too high. Those kind of limits do not apply to NPP dairy. The other kind of payment limit is you can only get, you know, $60,000, or you can only get payments on 3 million pounds of your milk. And those kind of limits do not apply. So the only limitation is in you can't get more than 90% of your production history. Now, the flip side of that coin is if you had some kind of change on your farm where your actual marketings fell below your covered production history, you covered 4 million pounds per year, and you know you had something happen on your farm and you're only producing 3 million pounds per year, you would still get the full payment on the 4 million or whatever your covered production history is. So it actually also works in the other direction. You can have actual marketing below your covered level and still get paid on your covered level.
Andy, can I chip in on that too?
Certainly.
The only other payment limitation would come in the form of sequestration. So such that payments may be reduced in the event of...
Good point. Yeah, good point. Unlike MILC, USDA has determined that if there is a general sequestration where the government has to make these across-the-board cuts, farmers could feel good about helping out with the national budget because they would be getting less payments and saving that money for our children and their inheritance. So we're all feeling happy about that, right?
I'm not going to touch that one, Andy. I'm going to move. How does the Northeast market track the national average? Do they move in tandem? Would a catastrophe in the Northeast move the national average?
Well, I'll take a quick shot at that, and certainly John and Mark can chime in. And Mark, of course, in particular, has experience in our world as well as now in the Midwest. But I'll say two things. One is whether you're looking at a state number or an individual farm, I'm pretty sure you would find over a period of years that there's a high degree of correlation between a state number or an actual farm number and this national margin, a high degree of correlation, but they're not going to be the same number. That's basis, but I also think we would find that the relationship would change from one year to the next. That's basis risk. So they might go up together, they might go down together, but they might, kind of like the accordion, sometimes they're closer and sometimes they're farther apart. I think if we look at New York prices or Northeastern prices in general, they tend to be pretty close to a U.S. average. But for most people who are buying feed, they would look at those national corn, soybean meal, and hay prices and say, "Wow, I wish I could get those. I paid a lot more than that." And so if you plugged in your own national numbers or your own local numbers, I think we'd see actually a little bit narrower margin. Could a Northeast catastrophe or serious event move the needle nationally? I'm going to say, yeah, but we're talking about prices, not harvest, so there isn't going to be some kind of separate movement on the New York price that's completely different from someplace else. I can't think of an example where that's happened. And there might be something local related to transportation or something with respect to feed, but I don't know that we see some really inconsistent price movements in the Northeast on the feed side either. Mark, I'm sure you've got a better idea. What are your thoughts when you think about this question?
Well, I do think that this margin is going to move, if not perfectly in lockstep, just very closely to what a Northeast dairy producer is going to receive. And so it will be an effective tool for helping them manage risk. That said, I do think that there are some differences. A good example is 2009. I think you have seen that this moved almost identically with the needs and the margins that you had in the Northeast. 2012, I'm betting it didn't move quite the same. And the reason is that 2012 was not a milk price problem, it was a feed price problem. And to the extent that Northeast dairy producers grew a higher proportion of their feed and maybe weren't impacted by that national or the drought through the Midwest area, they might not have been as impacted by feed prices as farms that were purchasing much of or most of their feed. So those things can be a little bit different.
Can I chip in again?
Sure.
So just a plug again, today on Farm Doc, I put an article out on this very topic, that is basis considerations with MPP dairy. And so if you think of MPP as kind of like a put option, then you want to think of basis in two ways. If if your margin and the MPP margin move identically, and that is that basis never changes, then what you see is what you're going to get. But if you look at the data, that's not the case. Basis varies from month to month and from year to year. So what that means is that your cash margin may not be offset at a 1-to-1 ratio with the MPP margin. And so if you're using MPP to protect the floor and your basis moves more in one direction or the other, it creates the potential for unanticipated gains or losses from a target MPP price floor. So it creates some additional uncertainty if you have basis risk, which can happen at the local level. So you could have basis in just the Northeast, for example, if something happened to the overorder premiums there that didn't happen elsewhere in the country, and that can move basis in either direction. But basis can also be influenced by the individual dairy farmer. So if you improve your component levels or you're more efficient feeding your dairy animals, you can change your basis relationship to improve it so that you have a better idea what floor MPP is actually protecting.
Okay, next question. When are the payment periods for the year? How many months ahead do you have to pay for?
Well, in terms of paying premiums, that's calculated as an annual number. And as I mentioned in one of the slides, if you've got the cash and you want to put that expense in the year in which you enrolled, say 2014, you can pay those premiums all up front. The second choice is you can take your total 12-month premium bill plus the $100 fee, and you can pay 25% of that on February 1st of 2015 and the remaining 75% on June 1st of 2015. I can also tell you that USDA has invited comments on changes to the rules in not this year but in subsequent years. And one of the things that they're expecting is that they will get ideas and suggestions for alternative ways to pay premiums. So, for example, one of the things that a lot of folks have asked is, could I have this done by assignment on my milk check, and every month or every 2 weeks or twice a month have an assignment made to FSA to pay that in installments. They have definitely not said they will or they won't do that, but there are those ideas out there, and it could be that there will be some additional payment options in future years.
Next question. Who and how will the premiums being paid be managed and administered? What happens if there is an excess in premiums or a shortfall?
Well, some of you might be old enough to remember the old assessment program from the 1980s. If you do, you might remember that a lot of people thought that when they paid their assessment, they were paying for the cost of the price support program. And maybe in some spiritual way they were, but in fact, in point of fact, that program and this current program work the same way. When you pay your premiums, you're going to pay them to the United States Treasury. When you get a benefit payment, you're going to get it from the United States Treasury. And you can do the math and see which number is bigger, but in point of fact, nobody's going to care, and it's just going to go into the vast maw of the United States Treasury, and it isn't going to make any difference to FSA's budget. It isn't going to be a pool of money that you set aside to make sure you've got enough. And I think it's almost a sure bet that over the life of the bill, the premiums will fall far short of the benefit payments.
Next question is identified for Mark, so we'll try him. Mark, if you average the years that you showed individually, what level of margin would have made the most sense? So I think the questioner's saying, you know, let's take a 5-year average or something like that, and have kind of a game rule here that we're going to ensure at a particular margin level. What do you think that would tell you?
That's a good question. First of all, I want to disabuse people of the notion that we can easily give you rules of thumb, because this is a little bit more nuanced a program than that. For relatively smaller farms, that means if you're trying to cover milk production 4 million pounds or less, then I can tell you, looking back over a 10-year time period, if you were to pick only one level every year, and it's the same level, that an $8 level would have given you the highest level of payback. Now, admittedly, it had the highest premiums associated with it too, but it would have been the highest net benefit at the $8 level. If you're a large farm, that would not be true. You'd have to look at moving down. I do think that the tool is really so easy and straightforward to use. I would encourage people to play with it on their own and see what the impacts would be for their operation using their own production histories, and you know, make those kind of choices.
Very good. Winding down on the questions here, but next to the last one that I've got here anyway, if you are a current producer but do not sign up for 2015, but then want to sign up for 2015, what years would be looked at for your production history?
Jim, can I ask you to repeat that question, because I want to be sure I heard the dates correctly.
Yeah. If you are a current producer but do not sign up for 2015, but then want to sign up for 2016, what years would be looked at for your production history?
Okay. So whether you sign up now or even wait until 2018, they're going to go back to the same rules that apply in this registration period. So if you were a dairy farmer on February 7th of 2013 or before, you're going to look at those 2011, 2012, and 2013 numbers, no matter what year you first signed up for the program. If you happen to be a dairy farmer who starts after that magic date last year, so you started on February 8th of 2013 or later, they're going to look at that very first year that you began this new operation, and they're going to fill in the blanks if it's an incomplete year. So if you started in 2014 and you don't sign up till 2017, they're going to go back to your 2014 numbers. They'll do the extrapolation. They'll give you a full 12-month estimate of your production history based on your 2014 marketings, and that will be your production history. So you're either going to go back to 2011 to 2013, or you're going to go back to your first year as a producer.
Okay, I'm going to ask, let me see, I may have one more question here. Yeah, I do have another question. Your large farm scenario for 2009, $6.50 was the best number. It seems most large farms would most likely opt out or just take the minimum. I want to respond to that. It's a comment, but I think he's trying to get some commentary.
Yeah, this is a Mark question.
Okay. I don't think that would be the case. I think, you know, we've talked with a lot of farms of all sizes, and that includes some very large farms. And many of the larger farms already have fairly sophisticated risk management strategies in place. Maybe they're working with a broker, and they're fairly regularly hedging or using options, or maybe cash forward contracts when those are available at a reasonable price. And many of those producers that I've spoken with are indicating that they don't plan on abandoning what they're already doing and jumping to this, but would rather use this in conjunction with the programs that they have in place. So that speaks to me a little bit of saying I may look at this and see whether it suggests that there's an opportunity in the year ahead. So in that 2009 example, when we were looking ahead from September 2008, that farm might have anticipated that this is a year when it's likely to have payouts. And we have seen that if that's true, then many cases those payouts are going to be more than the fees and premiums that you would have paid. So I think you're going to find that farms will buy up to a different level. Buying all the way up to $8 really requires that you're pretty sure it's going to be a bad year like 2009 or 12 was, to have the payments be bigger than your fees and premiums. So 650 may be a reasonable level for a lot of folks to look at.
You know, this question and some other ones, and certainly questions that we hear in the field pretty regularly, can be, are kind of like saying, where's the sweet spot? And I think a lot of us, as we've looked at this, have said or thought, you know, 6 or 650 feels like a sweet spot, feels like a level that's high enough that you would actually get a benefit payment fairly often, but not so high that you're killing yourself with premiums. As Mark was suggesting, you want to be careful about oversimplifying this. I mean, it's tempting and it's not entirely wrong in some respects, but it's a little dangerous to try to boil this down to an overly simple rule. When you look at just the chart on premiums that I provided, one of the things that you see is those tier 2 premiums at 7, 750, and 8 really skyrocket up above 650. And as Mark was saying, when you look, if you were sitting in the fall of 2008, looking to 2009, and you looked at the decision tool, it would say, oh, 650 looks like a good spot, and oh my goodness, $8 would be crazy. And it turns out the way 2009 actually played out, $8 would have been the coverage level that would have gained you the largest net benefit. And so, as Mark was saying, suggesting, it's not inconceivable that $8 could be a good choice, even for a very large farm. That's not to say we're recommending pick 8 all the time, but it's just to really point out it's a little dangerous making overly simple rules.
Yeah, and just to follow up, Andy, one further comment is that in looking at what we might call shallow losses, or maybe margins that are likely to be in the $7 to $8 range, some payments possible but not a lot, and you're a larger farm, you may want to look at reducing the amount of milk that you cover. Take it down to a percentage that gets you closer to covering 4 million pounds of milk, so they're all at that lower tier level. That may be optimal for some of the farms, too, to do that.
So we're going to wrap up here in the next few minutes, and this is what we're going to do. I've got one final question I'm going to address to Andy, and then I'm going to go to back through our batting order, but Mark, John, finish with Andy, and ask each of them to do a brief parting comment from today's program, maybe a point they want to reemphasize or what have you. Give Andy the last parting comment, and then I will wrap up the program with a comment on my behalf. So, Andy, my last question for you is you've got some very good contacts in the Secretary of Agriculture's office there in D.C. I think you spent a sabbatical there within a couple of years, and so my question is, as you talk to those folks there, how do they perceive this program versus the dairy margin, LDP program? Do they regard them as kind of equal siblings? We're indifferent as to which one succeeds in the marketplace. Are they, or do they have a favorite in the race here? I used the wrong term, LGM dairy.
Yeah, well, that's a good and an interesting question. Think about it this way. If you ask Grandpa, which is the favorite grandchild, that's a kind of a tough question. If you ask Mom, my son, or my daughter, who their favorite child is, or whether or not they like my child's cousin better, that's a little bit different question. Grandpa's going to have a hard time picking between grandchildren, but once you go the next generation down and you're talking about sons and daughters versus cousins, then you're going to have a favorite. The LGM dairy program is run by the Risk Management Agency. The MPP Dairy Program is run by the Farm Service Agency. These are the sons and daughters of the Secretary of Agriculture. And now you're talking about their children. And I can tell you FSA is going to do its best to make MPP Dairy a successful program. And they will say, God bless my cousin, I wish them well, but our responsibility is to MPP Dairy. The Risk Management Agency is going to say the same. Our responsibility is LGN Dairy. We're going to do our best to promote this program and sustain it and offer it. We wish our cousin over in Farm Service Agency well, but that's not my problem. And Secretary Vilsack is going to say, I love them both, and you should pick the one you like.
Okay, very diplomatic, Andy. I wouldn't have expected any less of you. Thank you. I'm going to go back to Mark for a brief wrap-up comment.
Well, this is clearly a good and a new program in the risk management toolbox for dairy producers. I'm not really sure what sign-up is going to be for this program. We're curious about that, of course. In other words, is it going to be a lot of dairy farmers that sign up or a lot of milk production that gets signed up? I suspect it will, perhaps not this year. One of the reasons is that at this point in time, we aren't forecasting a lot of payouts. But by the time we get toward the end of November, when the sign-up period is, it could be the case that this actually looks like we've got markets that are reacting to different data than they have today. So I would also like to let people who are listening know that if you go in and sign up for catastrophic coverage, for example, you still can go in and make a decision in this election period through the end of November, November 28th, to increase the level of coverage should that be indicated by the markets. So good tool. I hope people use it and work well with the program.
Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate your participation today. John, brief comment.
Well, I agree with everything that both Mark and Andy said, and I think that when you think about this, the goal of this program is to shift dairy farmers into a new era away from direct payments or countercyclical payment style programs into an era where, similar to crop insurance, dairy farmers have some skin in the game. And so when you move farmers from that era to this new era where they have skin in the game, they need to think about their own financial balance sheet and carefully consider their farm level factors. Things like their debt to asset ratio, their net farm income, liquidity, farm efficiency, to understand exactly where they are. And by understanding their farm level financial risk, they can then turn around and develop a hedging strategy that recognizes A, if I need MPP, B, when I need MPP, and C, how much MPP do I need? And that, I think, is the important concept here.
Okay, thanks, John. And again, thanks for all your work on putting this together. Andy, a wrap-up comment.
So I'll say two things. One is, again, John, Mark, none of our colleagues are at all feeling like we need to be salesmen for this program. We're not pitching it. We're not saying you should or you shouldn't participate. But I will go as far as saying, as we've looked at this, we think the program warrants a very careful look by producers, that it has some positive attributes, that it offers some potential that is quite different from MILC or other programs, and it's a little more complicated than those, but it's going to be well worth taking a look at. The second thing I'd like to say is one of those things I said early on. Each of us looks at these kinds of programs, these kind of choices, and after a while say, well, this is what makes sense to me. And in fact, we might even say, well, it's obvious. This is what you ought to do. And then you compare notes with somebody else, and they go, well, I didn't think that was obvious at all. I thought it was something else. And that's when you realize that we all look at these programs with a different lens, with a different idea of what it is we're trying to do and what it is this program is supposed to do. And I think all of us who are advising people, and certainly the people that are making decisions, should kind of step back from what seems obvious and say, why is it obvious to me? What do I think I'm trying to accomplish with this program? And one way to do that is to ask yourself, if I pay a premium, big, small, or in between, and I never get a benefit, am I going to think this program is a failure? Am I going to think this program doesn't work? Or if that situation occurs, I pay a premium and I never get a benefit, and am I going to step back and say, oh, thank God, the market didn't go south. I didn't get a benefit because I didn't need one. Which of those mentalities are you going to bring to this equation? And that's going to begin to help you understand how you ought to approach coverage levels and choices that you make.
And thank you, Andy, both for your participation today and your leadership over the years in the Northeast area information and assisting producers and others to have the kind of good economic information that they need to make good decisions. So we really appreciate that. My wrap-up comment is going to play off of Andy's a little bit. My observation is that the right answer is going to be unique to each producer out there, and thus the beauty of the tool set here. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all here. I'm going to encourage, especially those of you who are Farm Credit East members, talk to your business consultant and or your loan officer, because this really, to make sense of this analysis, you've really got to take it one step further. You've got to tie it back to your income statement and to your balance sheet, ultimately, to assess what's right for you. And if I'm your loan officer or business consultant, I think the discussion goes something like this. What's your break-even milk price? If you've got a high break-even milk price, it's up in the up into the $20 range, this program is going to be very important to you. If you've got a $15 break-even milk price, well, probably the CAT coverage is going to be more than fine. But you've got to tie it back to your break-even milk price. The next factor, and I'm going to be overly simplistic here, how much liquidity have you got on your balance sheet? What's going to happen the next time there is a tough year? Are you going to be able to fall back on some, deferred milk checks, prepaid expenses, all of that type of liquidity that a lot of you carry forward from the good years? So that's going to be the next question. If there isn't much liquidity on your balance sheet, that means you're going to feel the pain of a down margin year before most others will. You're going to need additional protection. And I guess the next to the last question, the last kind of financial question is going to be how much additional loan capacity have you got with, whether it's Farm Credit East or some other lender? Are you borrowed up to your last dollar, or do you have a lot of capacity that could be tapped in a tough year? Now, I've oversimplified it, but those are really the issues that the analysis sets up to figure out what the right type of coverage is going to be. And then the last issue is a non-economic one, but how well do you sleep at night? And all of us have different appetites for risk. It's a fairly well identified human trait. Some people, worry a lot about, geez, what would happen if another 2009 came around? Some people sleep very well no matter what. So it comes back to you, your family, your partner's appetite for risk. If it's not so much, you like to be safe, then again, I think you're going to want to take a different level here than those who are very comfortable with dealing with the swings. So great tools here. I thank the presenters. I wish all of you, especially those of you producers who have to make the decisions, wish you well in that process. Appreciate all of you being here today.